Okay, this is a presentation on the handguns or the sidearms of the Philippine Scouts. All right, when the United States during the Indian Wars had used what was called the single action army with a 7.5-inch barrel was the standard sidearm. This particular pistol was made in 1884. It is a black powder frame. Previous owner did extensive work on it. He put in a smokeless cylinder, a new barrel, and of course he put the fancy stag-like grips. But you have to, understand the concept. The revolver was single action, and to load it, you had to put single rounds in, and to eject them, you had to punch them right out through the center. Very slow, tedious, not good. So the U.S. Army decided that now with the smokeless era, what they really needed was a double-action revolver and one with a swing-out cylinder. And they then came out with what's referred to as the Colt New Army, New Navy, or the military called it the Colt Double-Action Revolver Caliber 38. And this one here is an example of what the guns look like originally. Now, during the Spanish-American War, we only had 2 months of actual combat. Now, Teddy Roosevelt carried a Colt 38 Navy, an earlier model, and he described shooting 2 Spaniards and seeing them drop like jackrabbits. So at first it appeared as if this was a new modern gun, double action, smokeless powder, small caliber. But when they got to the Philippines, that would have been the issue. Now the holster over here is an original holster. You will notice it's for left-handed. That's because the idea was that cavalry, their main arm was the saber, which they needed to reach with their right hand. The handgun was the backup. So revolvers were put in the left-handed holsters during the Civil War and after the Civil War. And for a long time, if you got issued a revolver, it was issued in a left-handed holster. Now, when they get to the Philippines, this is the guns they were using. Now, you all remember George Bush coming up there and saying, mission accomplished in regard to Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, a similar thing occurred in the Philippines. In 1901 or 1902, in that era, the president declared that the Philippine Insurrection was over. Mission accomplished, okay? And in that case, they too were sort of jumping the gun when they said it was all over. Just because they had captured Aguinaldo, that did not mean the insurrection was totally over, no more than killing Osama bin Laden eliminated Al-Qaeda, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, so in the early part of the war, this is what an American soldier would carry. And at that time, they're also creating what we call the Philippine Scouts. There were the Moro Scouts, the Macabebe Scouts, and the Philippine Scouts. Now, the term Scouts came from the West. Whenever we hire Native Americans to work for us, we call them Scouts. So when we go to the Philippines and we hire natives, we call them Scouts. Okay? Now, the gun here was actually older than this, and it had a free-floating cylinder. That was the mistake of that early model. There was no cylinder lock, so all those guns were sent back. This gun here was actually made in 1892, but if you look at the bottom, it says U.S. Army Model of 1901. What they did is they would send them back to the Colt factory. The factory would put in new parts, buff out the old marking, but kept the original serial number. So the serial number tells you the gun was made in the early 1890s, but then it says model of 1901 on it, okay? Now, they added the lanyard, and then later on is a 1903 model where they actually tightened up the bore to give it more accuracy. Now, this is the round they used. It's a 38 caliber round, okay? What they did was, they took the original 38 short Colt that was a round that was designed for when they converted percussion revolvers to cartridge guns. Then they added some more powder, made it a little longer, and that became the 38 Colt. Later on, they stretched it a little bit more, and it became the 38 Special. Mm-hmm. Then they stretched it some more, and it became the 37 Magnum. Okay.
Then they straightened them in a 57 Maximum.
Right. So that was the cartridge. Now, living in the Philippines were many different ethnic religious groups. One of them was the Spanish referred to as Moros, which means Muslims. And they basically wanted to be left alone. They had converted to Islam before the Spanish came. They did not want to be ruled by Spanish Christians. They did not want to be ruled by Philippine Christians. And they did not want to be ruled by American Christians, okay? They continued to rebel because they wanted basically self-determination. Now, with the decision that the insurrection is over, all right, with the insurrection over, now comes a technicality. With the insurrection out of the way, the military should not be doing anything, correct?
That's the way it's supposed to be.
So the civil government will fight the Moros. And they create what's called the Philippine Constabulary. Now, the Philippine Constabulary is modeled on the Texas Rangers. Okay, Texas Rangers. Now, they, in no time at all, found this does not work when you're going up against a guy who's going what they call juramentado. Now, juramentado was this combination of religious fervor, warrior ethos, plain old-fashioned courage, sometimes altered with drugs, or the belief that 73 virgins in the next life is better than 4 wives this time with 4 mother-in-laws, okay? So they were motivated soldiers. And what they were finding out was the 38 did not work. So the first solution was to bring back the old toy. Bring back the Colt single-action army. Right, 45 caliber. But the constabulary, and I do not have an example, they're very rare, expensive. The constabulary, not being part of the military, basically goes to Colt and says, we want a double action swing out in 45. And they get issued what's called the Philippine Model, also called the Alaskan Model. It's a double action revolver with a very big trigger guard. Now, the argument was that it was made with a big trigger guard so people in Alaska could wear gloves and shoot it, and in the Philippines, so a Filipino could put 2 fingers on the trigger and yank it back, okay? They're very rare, and they were not issued to the military. They were for the constabulary. Now, soldiers being sent to the Philippines were told, get a 45. Now, if you were an officer, you might just go and buy one. If you were an NCO, that would have wiped out your paycheck, you know, but the word was out. Now, at that time, General Crozier was in charge of the Ordnance Department, and he was looking for a replacement, and the complaints were coming in from the Philippines, you need a 45. But he goes, we need a 45 automatic. So what's happening is the usual procedure of research, development, experimentation, calls for bid. Well, all this has taken a lot of time. In the meantime, the guys in the combat zone are going,
getting the shit kicked out of
we need a 45. So as a temporary measure, and only in the combat zone, they go to Colt. Now, Colt is making what's called a new service. Now, they're making it in 45 caliber. The New York State Police are carrying them. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police are carrying them. The Canadian Army that's being sent to South Africa is carrying them. And it's an off-the-shelf item. So rather than go through the normal procurement process, which is going to take forever, they simply go to Colt and go, make us revolvers. Put a lanyard ring on it, get rid of the plastic stocks. We want a wood stock and we want a lanyard. And they create what's called a 1909. It's a regular new service in 45 Colt. But somebody in the Army goes, you know what? The 45 ammunition has a very thin rim, but it's designed
for the single action.
For the single action, because this rod kicks the rounds out through the center. We want more positive extraction. So they create their own ammunition. And that's it right here. It's the 1909 45 revolver ammunition, of which I have 4 rounds right here. Now, the importance of this. Here is a cylinder from a black powder single action. If I start putting rounds in here, the rims catch. And after a while, they're actually stacking up. The gun won't work.
It won't turn.
So what happened was, these worked fine in the 1909, but if you were issued a single action, your 6-shooter was now a 3-shooter. You had to load every other cylinder. Okay, and people were told, when you get this ammunition, if you're carrying one of those,
you're fucked.
Every other cylinder needs a round. Okay?
You're in deep doodle.
Yeah, you got a 3-shot pistol, is what you've got. because of these extra long rims. Now, the holster. They designed a holster for the 1909. Okay?
Which is the same as that one, but bigger.
Bigger. But again, it's left-handed. It's left-handed because, again, you need to keep your right hand free for your sword or for controlling your horse. All right?
Well, the way it was supposed to be, you draw the sword and you draw the pistol.
Right. Now, this pistol was probably the one that was used, and these two were probably the ones that were used most in the Moro, putting down the Moros. Because these were the guns that worked. But the constabulary had a double action, big long trigger guard. The constabulary, it was their main job, was to handle it as a police action. Then if things got real bad, you called on the Army called on the Philippine Scouts. All right, over here is a Bolo. A U.S. Bolo, made in 1910, Springfield Armory, okay? There's also a Bolo Bayonet that they made. It's rare, and most of them probably ended up in Japanese hands, okay? But they were made for the Springfield rifle. And there's pictures of Moro Scouts, Philippine Scouts with them. And from what I understand, by the time of the battles of Bataan and Corregidor, Philippine Scout cavalry units carried Bolo bayonets.
The 26th Cavalry.
26th Cavalry. So they would have capability of both, okay? By time the 1911 comes out, okay, it's called the 1911. They didn't start making them until 1912, and they didn't arrive in the Philippines till 1913, okay? So chances are they weren't used.
They weren't used. No, they used it.
Yeah. By that time, by 1913, the Bolo Insurrection was over, contrary to the declaration back in 1901 or 2, whatever it was. The difference is, by then they were realizing the handgun is going to be your primary weapon as a cavalryman, okay? So what's going to happen is, you see the left-handed holster for the Colt. All your revolvers are left-handed. Now, with the automatic, we're going right-hand, okay? When you got your they never made a left-handed holster for the 1911s. They went right to right hand. Now, that would have served a Philippine Scout in 1913. Just hold one. Yeah, good. All right. Anyway, 1913 to 1945, whatever. That's what a Philippine Scout's going to carry. Now, there is a picture from Bataan of a captain,
Wearing a 45
Captain
revolver.
Wearmouth, okay? He is known as the one-man army of Bataan. Now, there are pictures of him, and sometimes they're reversed. Somebody flips the negative over. But according to the written observation, he carried 2 guns and a Thompson. Now, your 45 holster is right-handed. Your revolver holster is left-handed. And there's a picture of him with one of his Philippine aides who's got a commercial, what's called a hunter holster. And it's a right-hand holster. But I would not be surprised that Captain Wagan there carried the 1909 holster. Now, he would not have had a Colt 1909 revolver. They had been pulled out of the system because of the
Maybe
ammunition.
17.
But the gun that his aide seems to have in his holster is a Smith & Wesson 1917. So there's that distinct possibility that Smith & Wesson 1917s were also issued to the Philippine Scouts because prior to World War II, there was a handgun shortage, and the 1917 revolvers, Smith & Wesson and Colt, were pulled out of storage, and some might have been sent. Now, somebody might look at that picture and go, oh no, he's carrying a Victory model. The picture was taken in April of 1942. No. Unless Scotty was beaming boxes of Victory revolvers into the Philippines, there weren't any there.
The Victory Model, I think, was 43.
And by then, by April or May is when they start putting smooth grips on Victories. Before then, they got checkered grips. So it's unlikely it's a Victory model. It's probably a Smith & Wesson 1917. And, you know, that's probably an example of a photograph telling us what might have been used. Now, your 1909 was never meant for the entire Army. As a matter of fact, let me see if I got it right here. Okay, it goes 19,153 out of 19,503 went straight into service in the Philippines.
Most of the bulk.
Boom. That's where they went to the theater where they were needed. It was an off-the-shelf item. It was a temporary replacement while they're working on deciding what's going to be the Army automatic. Let's get something to the troops that need it. The 1909 is what they probably used, and then maybe backed up with a Colt single-action Army.
Actually, this was a 7-inch barrel, and they took it out of the store.
Cut them down to 5.5.
And
Right.
made it. It was
Now,
called
this
the
manual
artillery
here
model.
for the Colt, this manual is from the Government Printing Office, 1912. Okay, and it's dated April 1st, 1905, revised October 3rd, 1908. Just because they had these in the Philippines, they didn't get rid of these for the rest of the Army. And the Army didn't sell these off as surplus till 1922. They kept them for World War I, and then they decided they had to go. At the same time, they took all these 1909s out of service, sold them too. There was 2 calibers they didn't want to bother with, okay? The handgun cartridge for the U.S. Army is the 45 ACP, and the discussion, okay?
Well, the Army had, first of all, the Indian War. They were used to the 45. Then they get a bad experience with this. They say, no, we never go back to 38s again.
Right. And over here, this is original ammunition here, 38 caliber, and this is original 1909, the special larger rimmed cartridge for the 1909 revolver.
Have you shot this?
Yes. Now, the holster that they designed for the 1909, when World War II came along, they said, we already have a holster in the system. So they made more of these and stuck 1917s in them, Colt or Smith & Wesson, but you still had a left-handed holster. It's not until 1942 that they designed a holster for that's right-handed. So if you find a right-handed holster, 1942, these, First World War, beginning of World War II, left-handed revolver holster, because you gotta keep your sword hand free. Right now, as a collector, finding them in good condition is hard, because the old expression is, for horses, they were rode hard and put away wet. They were used.
Well, it's the same with this one too.
No, Smith & Wessons, you get a lot of them in pretty good shape. Same with Colts. But 1909s, like I said, they sent them right to the Philippines. They went right into combat. And, you know, they took a lot of use and abuse. Only a couple hundred were kept back in the States. And some of them were later sold to private agencies. You know, they didn't want to maintain the cartridge. You know, it was an extra cartridge to worry about, particularly after World War I. So off they go.
I used to get them. I know you don't people out there. You don't do that kind of shit. There was somebody who was able to get there.